Welcome everybody to the Existentialist Society in Melbourne, Australia. Existentialism is an umbrella term covering diverse and often conflicting schools of thought. Consequently, we are not agreed on who or what is an existentialist. We simply agree to disagree. I'm David Miller. I'm hosting today's session. Our guest speaker today is Dr. Russell Blackford, who's with the University of Newcastle, and he's the author of a book which has the same title as today's lecture discussion, which is How We Became Post-Liberal, the Rise and Fall of Toleration. Russell, over to you.
Okay, thank you, David. So yeah, the topic of the talk is what David just said, how we became post-liberal. So I have this little book called How We Became Post-Liberal, The Rise and Fall of Toleration, which was actually published just approaching a year ago. Came out in Australia a few weeks later than overseas, came out here at the start of 2019 with a copyright date, of 2024, with a copyright date of 2024. It's a sequel to a book that came out in 2019 called The Tyranny of Opinion. And I want to talk a little bit about that book as well at the start of it. So the Tyranny of Opinion, Conformity and the Future of Liberalism. The two books are meant to be readable in isolation from each other, but in a way that I'll describe, they are kind of companions. There's a small amount of overlap. They're meant to be kind of independent, but the way it works is this. Back 5 or more years back when I was writing The Tyranny of Opinion, I was writing about liberalism and about what I saw as a whole range of pressures to conform that we have in our Western societies. I particularly discussed John Stuart Mill's views about individual liberty in his famous book On Liberty. I spend quite a lot of time in the early chapters of The Tyranny of Opinion talking about Mill's views. I deal in The Tyranny of Opinion with the psychological literature on conformity. And I discuss a situation as I saw it then and continue to see it, where we might be afraid to express unpopular or controversial ideas publicly, or even in some of our private discussions. I move in particular to modern threats from the political left. Now, in saying that, of course, the traditional threats to individual liberty and freedom of speech have been from the political right, and I'll say some more about that. But as I see it, we've reached a point in our current liberal societies, so-called liberal democratic societies, where there are threats to liberty, freedom of speech, and pressures to conform coming from all political directions. And that's what I see, that's what I mean when I talk about it's becoming post-liberal. As I will define liberalism in a moment, we are seeing pressures away from liberalism coming from all political directions. Now, when I talk about these specific threats from the political left, I see them as coming often from a kind of ideological position, which is focused on not offending various demographic groups that have historically been seen as oppressed. In other words, I'm talking about identity politics, right? But an entire ideology based on identity politics. So there are all kinds of pressures to conform coming from all sorts of political and other directions, including from the political right. But we are now seeing pressures from a certain ideological component, which has become increasingly powerful over the last 15 years on the political left, I refer in the Tyranny of Opinion to that as a kind of revisionist liberalism, not what liberalism originally meant, but a kind of ideology that has historical connections with, in particular, US style liberalism. So to give the flavour of that, I'll read a little passage from the end of chapter 7 of The Tyranny of Opinion, and then I'll segue into talking about the new book. But I talk at the end of chapter 7 of The Tyranny of Opinion. I say thanks in part to group polarization, which is a psychological concept that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Thanks in part to group polarization, this revisionist ideology goes beyond a liberal-minded concern to break down legal and social barriers that disadvantage people from certain groups, preventing them from living as they wish and realizing their potential. That concern would be a natural outgrowth of Enlightenment liberalism, and it is something that I fully support. Instead, an ideology based upon demographic identities has adopted many of the trappings of religion. It has its own esoteric doctrines, its own definitions of non-belief and apostasy, its own approved boundaries of doctrinal orthodoxy, and its own conceptions of heretical and blasphemous speech. So that was what I was talking about in my 2019 book, The Tyranny of Opinion. How we became post-liberal is a kind of prequel and a kind of sequel to The Tyranny of Opinion. And I'm going to talk about why I needed to write a book that is a kind of prequel and a kind of sequel. What I'm going to do, I am going to try to keep my talk as short as I can. I want to talk in a fairly informal way for maybe half an hour, something like that. Then I'll throw it open to questions, which David will chair, and I'll last for as long as I can before I start getting tired, right? So I'm now just going to talk for maybe about half an hour as to why I needed to write a prequel come sequel to the book and what this book, How We Became Post-Liberal, is all about. Put simply, I described a certain situation in The Tyranny of Opinion. In how we became post-liberal, I tried to deal with the situation, well, with the question of how that situation came about. So there's a lot more history in the book. There's not a lot of history in The Tyranny of Opinion. It's all philosophy and psychology. There's a much greater proportion of the history of all this in how we became post-liberal. And I ask how we came to live in a world where liberalism has become unfashionable. I seem to have lost my own visual here. Is that happening?
Have you turned off your video on the?
I haven't done any. Looks like I might have accidentally. Yeah, okay. Thanks, David. I don't know how I did that, but I must have accidentally touched the mouse, I guess. Okay. So I asked how that situation came about. I traced the origins of liberalism as a political movement or tendency, and I traced the origins of how toleration became a value in our societies, when that was not really a value historically in most societies, or to the extent it was in complicated ways. So how did liberalism become a powerful kind of political thought? How did toleration become a valued concept? And in the later chapters, how did we come to a point where toleration is now less valued across our political spectrum than it was, say, 50 years ago or whatever time you might want to choose? I want to say there's no golden age. We never reached a golden age of this. But about 50 years ago, it seemed to head in a certain direction. And that's not, as I see, the direction that we ended up going in between, say, the 1970s and now. There's also an issue here, particularly since we have some American participants, I gather, where the term liberalism is used in a rather different way in the United States from how it's used everywhere else. And that creates confusion. So I'll be careful to say that I'm talking about liberalism as in the sense of liberal theory. I'm not really talking about liberalism in terms of the 1930s New Deal, which is the beginning point of what Americans call liberalism, a kind of ideology, a kind of political view based on regulation of markets and government intervention in the operation of capitalism. When I talk about liberalism, I'm talking about a political theory that embraces individual liberty and freedom of speech. Now, of course, American liberalism to some extent also does that. But up to the 1930s or so, the term liberalism wasn't really used all that much in the US. It was very much a product of political debates that took place back in the 1930s and which created a rather different tradition in the US from the broader liberal tradition that I'm talking about. And I have to make those distinctions in the book, but I also need to make them right up front here so that my American viewers are not thinking I'm talking specifically about what's called liberalism in the US. I'm talking about the broader political tendency of liberalism, which goes back to the immediate aftermath of the French Revolution in Europe and draws upon strands of thought in the Enlightenment, which led up to the French Revolution and even the 17th century. Right, I'm talking about liberalism in that broad sense of an emphasis on things like separation of church and state, individual liberty, freedom of speech, untrammeled public discussion. That's what I mean by liberalism. Now, let me define that a bit more closely. The characteristics of liberalism in the sense that I've defined, I say there are four main characteristics. One is toleration. Toleration really means that there are things you object to, but for various reasons, you will put up with them. There'll be lots of things around that for various you think are wrong or false or maybe even immoral, but you have reasons why you don't actually try to suppress them. So a tradition of toleration as an approach to politics and tolerance as a personal characteristic. A tolerant person is a person who's prepared to put up with all sorts of things that he or she may actually have objections to. Right? I may think that Christianity is not true. I may think there's no God, but I don't try to suppress Christianity. As an atheist, I'm not interested in doing that. I expect that my Christian friends will not try to suppress atheism. I expect that my Protestant friends will not try to suppress Catholicism, even though they have an objection to it. They think it's the wrong interpretation of Christianity, and vice versa. Toleration, that's one of the fundamental aspects of this liberal tradition. The second one is simply liberty of the individual, which includes freedom of speech, untrammeled public discussion, and so on. The third idea is what I call meliorism, but it could just be called faith in progress, I suppose, or trust in progress. The idea that we can actually have societies that make conjoined intellectual and moral progress, and that will tend to come out of free public discussion. So toleration, liberty, meliorism, and related to all of that, pluralism, and acceptance of social pluralism, an acceptance that there are going to be all sorts of people in our societies. They'll come from all sorts of backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, philosophical backgrounds, moral, religious, etc. backgrounds. And we're not going to expect them all to conform to the same kind of way of life or viewing the world. So toleration, liberty of the individual, meliorism, or a positive idea about progress, and social pluralism. Those have been the four defining ideas that I think you'll find in this liberal tradition. And when you read the well-established histories of liberalism, different scholars will use different kinds of terminology. That's my terminology. But those four ideas in various forms of various terminologies tend to come up as those defining characteristics. So you hope that there'll be some kind of social harmony despite pluralism, despite disagreement, and despite the need for us to tolerate each other, even though we have objections perhaps to each other's worldviews, values, and ways of life. in a liberal society, as I've defined it, there'll be a great deal of freedom to live your life in your own way, obviously with limits. We can't all just go around, competing with each other by killing each other or whatever. There have to be limits, but within very broad limits, there will be freedom to live our own lives in our own way. There'll particularly be freedom of inquiry, freedom of opinion, and freedom of discussion. Freedom not only, this is important, freedom not only from governments that try to suppress all that, but even freedom from people trying to suppress each other in less formal ways, not through government and law. We'll cut each other a lot of slack in what we're prepared to put up with, even though we might have objections to it. We won't try to suppress each other's ideas, though we may fairly forcefully debate them with each other, right? That's the ideal of a liberal society. Now, that ideal has an origin, it has a history, and it has some coherence to it. I say some coherence because historically, the forces within society that tended to embrace this kind of liberal view, they were somewhat different. Partly they were religious nonconformists, partly they were utilitarians who followed people like Jeremy Bentham in England, the great utilitarian philosopher. Partly they were free trade economists. Partly they were people who supported the French Revolution and the writings of the French philosophers during the Enlightenment, but who were pretty disenchanted with the way the French Revolution actually turned out, with the activities of Robespierre and so on. So there are a number of streams that fed into the liberal tradition in the early 19th century, but these different streams fed into the kind of movement that I've just described. Now, both books discuss how these ideas have become pretty unfashionable. I mean, the kind of language that I have just used, this language of toleration, individual liberty, ameliorism or progress, social pluralism, so that's not really language that you hear very much anymore on either the political right or the political left. So how did we get to a point where that's the case? Up to the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s, that kind of language, those kinds of ideas had a lot of prestige in certain circles. You'll find if you go back to texts written during that period, that those ideas, that kind of language, had a lot of prestige, particularly in law reform circles. There was a strong tendency for law reformers during those decades to want to push down a path of those ideas prevailing in law reform. And of course, a lot of reform did take place. People on the right of politics at the time opposed a lot of that. I mean, they had a very different language. But what I'm saying is that now that language is not really used on the left either. You're more likely to hear on the left a lot of language about how certain speakers should not be allowed to, to have platforms to speak in certain forums. And you'll hear a whole different sort of language based around ideas of, identity, anti-discrimination, which of course liberals also don't want disadvantaged identity groups to be discriminated against, but with a quite different emphasis, an emphasis much more on people from those groups being able to flourish as individuals without being held back by belonging to those groups, right? The kind of language you hear on today's left talking about anti-discrimination, that language is quite different. The right, of course, has always been the party of organised religion, of the aristocracy, the rich, the authoritarian state, etc. Liberalism arose in reaction to that. It was the party of dissent, of individual freedom, and so on. Now, the left is not a monolith. If you look at the French Revolution, of course, the so-called left at the time, the people who literally sat on the left, they did become very authoritarian. Notoriously, we all know the story, and I tell it again, in how we became post-liberal, of Robespierre and the Terror. And we know, of course, that the communist left across Eastern Europe and beyond was highly liberal. When you get a group on any side of politics that wants comprehensive, radical change, wants an almost apocalyptic level of change, that group will almost always end up being illiberal, because it is so important to a group like that that the change take place very quickly, and that it not be hindered by bourgeois liberal dissent, as people like Lenin and Stalin would have said back in the early years of the Russian Revolution. So there's always been these elements that arise from time to time on the left, various kinds of the left. But the general position on the liberal left that we know of, the liberal left that people like Lenin and Stalin hated, was towards these things, toleration, individual liberty, freedom of discussion, and so on. So there's a history to how liberal ideas became quite fashionable, at least in certain circles, as the 18th, particularly the 19th and 20th centuries rolled on. How in law reform in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, those ideas were very fashionable. And then that started to turn around, and we started seeing, even within the new left in the US and elsewhere, we started seeing people arguing, in fact, against toleration. There's a famous essay by Herbert Marcuse, where he's arguing against toleration of ideas that he thought were unacceptable. He thought that the US in the 1960s was in such a state of social emergency that it was appropriate not to tolerate a whole lot of ideas, not just fascist ideas, for example, but politically libertarian ideas, even just ordinary politically conservative ideas. From the point of view of someone like Marcuse, these could not be tolerated. So we start seeing these liberal voices arising even in the 1960s, and increasingly in the 1970s. There's a sense by the mid-1970s on the left, across the liberal democracies, that the liberal political movement or tendency had largely failed to deliver the goods in a lot of ways, and that new styles of thought needed to be found on the left to carry forward the kind of social transformations that were thought desirable. We saw that as one very prominent example. We saw that within feminism during the 1960s and 1970s. The feminism of Betty Friedan and others on the left in the 1960s tended to be a liberal feminism. But as the 1970s rolled on, from, say, the mid-1970s through the 1980s, we saw very strong illiberal strands arising on the left, notoriously with people like Catherine McKinnon and Andrea Dworkin. But it wasn't just the feminist component of the left. We started to see this arising more generally. So we see a turnaround coming, and I describe this in more detail in the book. We see a turnaround starting to arise in the 1970s. We see the rise of identity politics in the 1970s. This was a new concept in the 1970s. You can go back and trace when that term was first being used and how it was being used, and how it referred at the time to a rising tendency from the mid-1970s onward in particular for various identity groups to analogize themselves with each other, to use a common kind of language, which was no longer the traditional language. And moving forward, we see an intensification of these tendencies with, as I argue in the book, an intensification around about 2010. I think a lot of people were blindsided starting around 2010, 2011, 2012 by just how much of an intensification there had been in this kind of ideology based more squarely on demographic identities and less squarely on the traditional liberal concepts of toleration, meliorism, pluralism, and liberty. So how we became post-liberal, I'm nearing the end of my talk, which is good because we're coming up to about half an hour. How We Became Post-Liberal is really a book that tries to trace all this. It goes way back to ancient history, tracing the rise of toleration and liberalism as valued movements and ideas, and from there, and why certain kinds of toleration were actually possible in classical antiquity under in societies of pagan syncretic religion, and how monotheistic religions were not prepared to be tolerant in quite the same way that the pagan religions were. So I want to say the book isn't all about just the last 50 years. I trace the rise of toleration and the rise of liberalism up to the French Enlightenment, the French Revolution, and then liberalism itself to the 19th century. But then try to focus on how that rise of liberalism leads to a decline in liberalism in the traditional way being fashionable over the past 50 years. And I'll get very near the end now. I have a quote to read from How We Became Post-Liberal. Just to try to put my finger on a point about toleration, and that is toleration does not come easy to people. Most people, perhaps all of us, in at least some contexts, find it difficult to accept the existence of and to put up with things that we object to, right? And if you feel strongly enough about why you object to things, there's a logic of persecution. There's a logic of why you will not put up with them. So I quote the great American jurist, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., from his dissenting opinion in the 1919 US Supreme Court case, Abrams v. United States. And I just say, in his dissenting opinion, Holmes states candidly, persecution for the expression of opinion seems to me perfectly logical, unquote. Now, Abrams was dissenting. He did not want persecution of opinion in that case. But he was saying, it seems perfectly logical. So what did he mean by that? Well, imagine that you believe yourself to be correct on some issue. Imagine that with that issue, the stakes seem to be very high, as they did, say, to Lenin and Stalin in Russia, or to Robespierre in revolutionary France. Imagine that you believe yourself correct on some issue where the stakes are high. If you care deeply enough, and if your opponent's speech does not seem merely futile, and that's therefore not tolerable for that reason, that doesn't matter anyway, and if you have the power to persecute those opponents for promulgating their wrong and dangerous opinions, well, why not persecute them? That's the logic of intolerance, the logic of persecution that has prevailed in many times and places, over hundreds, even thousands of years. So why do we expect that a logic of toleration rather than a logic of persecution would prevail in any society when there are such clear reasons why the logic of persecution can seem compelling to many people, right? That, at a deep level, is what I think we're up against. And the arguments to show why, why nonetheless the logic of toleration may be the better logic, that's a pretty hard thing to do. I try to make out that case in both books, but it's a pretty hard thing to do. And I don't know how any of you feel about it, of course. Some of you might think that the logic of persecution of ideas that you feel are dangerous, is entirely justified. We'll find out about that in question time. But what Justice Holmes is putting his finger on there is the logic of persecution that we're up against. Now, if you're like me and you want to have a liberal tolerant society and you've been observing trends, I'm old enough to have been observing these trends over the past 50 years, how optimistic or pessimistic should we be about a return to a society where traditionally liberal language and concepts and ideas are respected and carry prestige? How optimistic should we be about the return to something like that? Or should we be pessimistic? Should we think, well, the game's up and we're headed for new kinds of illiberalism, perhaps seeing illiberal tendencies on the populist right, and perhaps seeing illiberal tendencies on the identitarian left, which I've been describing in this talk. I have to admit that in the 5 years between when The Tyranny of Opinion came out at the end of 2018, beginning of 2019, and when How We Became Post-Liberal came out at the end of 2023, beginning of 2024, I actually became more pessimistic. I don't think that anything that happened that I've been observing in those 5 years has made me feel more optimistic from my point of view. However, I do think that the more we can investigate and understand the situation, see how it came about, see how it came about as a matter of historical contingencies, and it didn't have to be like that, the better we are at least to resist the illiberal tendencies that we see in today's society. And hence I do see some value in writing the book and in asking people if they're interested to read the book and other books that are being written by people who have similar concerns. So that's what How We Became Post-Liberalism is all about. And I think we started about 2:05. It's now 3:25, so I've kept myself to the half hour that I said I'd try to keep myself to. And I'm open to questions, David.
Well, thank you, Russell, for introducing your topic of how we became post-liberal, the rise and fall of toleration. So thank you. Now, before we throw the meeting open to questions, comments and discussion with Russell, I have a couple of announcements. The first of which is that the next Existentialist Society lecture discussion will take place in 1 month's time, and that's on Saturday, the 2nd of November. That's if you're in Australia. In North America, it would be the Friday evening, 1st of November. And Dr. Desmonda Lawrence is speaking on poetry and philosophy, Martin Heidegger and Paul Celan. So that's in 1 month's time. Now, the Existentialist Society hosts Zoom sessions like the one we're having for other groupings on every week at this time. So if you want to see the topics that are coming up each week, I'll put the link to the Existentialist Society's meetup platform in the chat. So for the discussion, for questions, comments and discussion, we'll use the raised hand method. And for those of you who don't know, you'll find the raised hand icon in the React tab at the bottom of your screen. So in that way, we'll get people to speak in turn and not interrupt each other. So Stephen, you're first.
Oh, thank you very much, Russell. A very interesting topic. I was just going to say that if I look at democracy and liberalism, that in a sense they do tend to go together a bit. But when I've looked at the history of democracy, and it goes back a long way, we're even going back to ancient Greece, ancient Rome, there seems to be that democracy and liberalism seem to have been a creation of the middle class. And it seems to be the case that this middle class is seeking to protect their property and their person and some of their liberties from the tyrants. Ancient Rome had a tyrant. The middle class overthrew the tyrants. Athens did the same. Even medieval Iceland at one point was a product of this when the Vikings had their own little republic. And of course, in English and American history, well, the Stuarts, what did the Stuarts do? I need money. Who will I shake down for some money? And of course, you ended up with the English Civil War and then finally the Glorious Revolution, where the middle class sought to place limits on the monarch or the tyrant. And so the capitalist, the merchant created democracy. It will always be the work of the merchant capitalist class. I think what we're seeing is societies in a growth phase will tend to be liberal because societies that grow find new ideas very useful. But now our society, like Greco-Roman society, has reached a point where growth is dying. And along with that, I think the respect for liberal values will die with it. Democracy will die. You know, as Spengler famously said, we'll have the Caesars in a century or so, and we're already seeing them now in our blessed Anglo-Saxon democracies. The Caesars, the oligarchs are now appearing. So I wonder what you have to say to that, Russell.
Yeah, well, it's an even more pessimistic view than mine. You obviously have a very pessimistic view about the trajectory of society in general. And there may be some basis for that. After all, there are issues about, you know, the limits to population growth and limits to growth in terms of energy expenditure, etc. The environmental limits, the problems of climate change, and so on. So when you think of it from that perspective, there might be something in your thesis. I must say it's not really my thesis, except I'll say this. One thing I certainly do agree with you on is that often it was not the, what we might call the working class, the industrial proletariat, which came into existence at a certain time in history. That was not the original source of resistance to authoritarianism. It was often, as you say, from the middle class. And often it was indeed even from the aristocracy. You know, if you go back to Magna Carta, you've got the aristocrats trying to rein in the king. So you've got all sorts of class struggles going on where whoever might have authority in a society is likely to be resisted by the forces underneath who see themselves as being repressed. And they will try to constrain that. There'll be various kinds of revolutions. And you, of course, can get a position where whoever is in charge in a transformed society then will not want further dissent. They'll want whatever was brought about. So, classically, when the Bolsheviks took over in Russia, they immediately said about repressing the liberals. You know, that there were liberals in Russia, but the liberals and the bourgeois press were seen as enemies once the Bolsheviks took power. Right. So you get all of these different kinds of class interests arising. And I don't have a particularly overarching theory of how that works, but something we should note. It's not just, a nice linear pattern that goes on. It'll be quite complicated patterns. Liberalism itself, though, is very much a product of the French Revolution, of the thought of the time, and of the experience of the massive wars of religion across Europe back in the 16th and 17th centuries. The French Wars of Revolution took place in the 16th century, and enormous numbers of people were killed. The 30 Years' War, which took place in the 17th century, was on a scale never seen again and never seen previously, never seen again until the First World War. So partly the kinds of thought that arose in the late 17th century through the 18th century, leading to the rise of liberalism, were a reaction to the sheer carnage of opposing intolerant forces that took place. So I don't have a kind of overarching theory of how struggles between classes and factions work. I just note that the ideas that I describe, the four ideas that I say make up the liberal tendency, they do arise from a history. And it was very much a history of intolerance, and class interests and so on certainly factored into how that history panned out.
Thank you, Russell. Jerry, it's your turn.
Yeah, I've been reading Fukuyama on the subject, and Fukuyama kind of describes liberalism as a at least in its inception, not in its current formation, but in its inception as a practical attempt to create a society where people could live together with diverse opinions without killing each other. Right. And so promoting tolerance was a very practical thing to do, because you got a bunch of people living together with different religious views, thinking of England, and how are they going to live together without killing each other?
Yep.
So I think that's an interesting conception of it.
On
and the
that
other
point,
thing,
I totally agree with. On that point, I agree with Fukuyama.
Yeah. I mean, there's other markers of liberalism, even classical liberalism, than that. But I thought that was an interesting one. I kind of expected this conversation would degenerate, and the evening's young, that would degenerate into a debate about, well, what is liberalism? What constitutes liberalism? Depending on how you define it, you like it. You define it this way, you like it. You define it that way, you don't like it. And one of the ways I would get around such a thing is, I don't care how you define it. I don't care what words you want to use. Isn't toleration a good thing? You can call that liberalism, Buddhism, paganism, but I don't care what you call it. Shouldn't we all be tolerant of each other, or more tolerant of each other? That value in and of itself. Yeah,
I think so. But the logic of persecution that I mentioned, it's a pretty powerful logic, right? Say you do think that society needs to be transformed in some thoroughgoing way, as the Bolsheviks did, for example, and lots of other people. Or say that you think that in order to go to heaven rather than hell in the afterlife, you have to believe certain doctrines. You are really, really going to want everyone to believe those doctrines, not some other set of doctrines. So if the stakes are high enough, then the logic of intolerance, logic of persecution, becomes very powerful.
Yeah, I heard another. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No. I was just going to say, we can trace through why it seems to be the logic of persecution seems pretty powerful at the moment. But at a very broad, abstract level, you can see why it can be very powerful.
I heard another scholar named Gray on the subject who said that we all want to live in interesting times, i.e., we want that Bolshevik revolution or whatever that revolution is. We all want to be in interesting times until they actually become interesting. And then we don't want that time. It's all well and good to say I want the revolution until people start dying.
Yeah. And I mean, the classic case is the case that Fukuyama talks about, and I also talk about, which was the Protestant Revolution in the early decades of the 16th century.
Right.
And the two sides could not tolerate each other because spiritual salvation was at stake. Now, it's all very well for Luther to come along and say, look, the church as it exists now in, 1517, it's not Christianity as you can read it in the Bible. It's turned into this quite different religion. It needs reform. It's all very well for Luther to come along and say that and say, well, we need all this reform. But then within a few years, you've got war across Europe, and that accelerated, of course. And,
I guess some people find tolerant societies to be intolerable.
Right. Because it doesn't bring the transformations that you think are needed for whatever it is, for spiritual salvation or for the liberation of workers, or even to have a sort of non-discriminatory society towards those historically oppressed groups. Now, look, I think realistically, there's probably a limit to how quickly you can bring about that kind of society. But I can also see why, if you are black or gay or whatever it is, you don't want to wait. You don't want to achieve it at a pace that's realistic. You want to achieve it now. Okay. So it makes sense that new kinds of ideologies come along rationalizing that and saying, well, it has to happen now. And that can mean a total transformation even in our language and an unwillingness to tolerate what's seen as a hindrance.
George, your turn.
Thank you very much. I guess I'm trying to figure out why this notion. Well, there's a couple of questions. First and foremost, why do you think we're post-liberal? And it seems to me, almost ironically, what you're trying to say is because African Americans, gays, women are, I'm gonna, for lack of a better word, I'm going to use tolerated, because they you have to treat them, presumably you have to treat them as equal human beings. Somehow we're post-liberal.
No, no,
And,
well,
well, I mean,
that's jumping a lot of steps.
I'm saying that's what I mean. It seems to me you start off by saying, well, the notion of, oh, we have to respect ethnic groups. Oh, that's identity politics. I mean, identity politics is not that, right? Identity politics is actually something quite different. But it does seem to me like what you're saying is, oh, because we can't be racist, we can't be sexist, we can't be homophobic. Oh, we're post-liberal somehow. And
Well, as
I
I
don't know
said,
how that follows.
jumping a lot of steps. Can I respond? Liberals wanted the liberation of women, liberation of Black Americans, liberation of Aboriginal Australians. They argued, in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, to remove laws against homosexuality, etc., etc. I mean, that's a liberal view, and it's a view, as I said in the passage that I read, it's a view that I totally share. So nobody is saying that holding that view is post-liberal. That's a liberal view. However, what happened, and this is a short summary of what's in the book, of course. What we saw happening during the 1960s, 1970s, and accelerating as time went on, was that did not come about at the sort of pace that was desirable, which I think was desirable, which many people think was desirable. Now, why didn't it come about at the pace that was desirable? Well, one reason is there's very powerful opposition to it from the political right, okay? The political right was largely successful. However, the result is that a politics based on liberal ideas to achieve those things was seen by many people on the left, not everybody, but many people on the left, as having failed. And it was thought that we have to move to other ideologies, not liberalism, but other ideologies based more directly on what we think about demographic groups and so on. We could discuss what these ideologies are. But they had input, for example, from various, from the Frankfurt School, say, from European post-structuralist views, from a whole range of views. And the result was the formation of an ideology that's no longer liberalism, and which, again, some, not all people on the left, thought might have a better chance of producing the kinds of transformations that were desired. So no one's saying that because people desire those sorts of transformations, that in itself is post-liberal. The question is, why do we now find ourselves, though, in a situation where many speakers are being literally deplatformed, or certain styles of talking and writing, even by people on the left, are regarded as intolerable? I mean, a classic example, the argument that's going on at the moment between the intersectional feminists come transgender activists on the one hand, and the gender critical feminists on the other hand, right? Now, that is a genuine argument. There are serious issues to be discussed about transgender women in women's spaces. There are serious issues to be discussed philosophically about what is the nature of being a woman, etc. All of these are serious political and philosophical discussions. But you will often see the people on one side being characterised as being simply bigots, engaging in hate speech, and being worthy of being denied platforms or being driven out of their jobs, as Kathleen Stock was, for example, as Holly Lawford-Smith has been facing that sort of opposition, not that successful so far, at the University of Melbourne. And that is what I'm calling post-liberal. It's not the idea that we should that we want to liberate various groups or to make life less discriminatory for various groups. That's a liberal idea. It's an idea that liberals share. It's the unwillingness to tolerate, to hold discussion, to give platforms to speakers who are disagreed with. That's what I'm calling post-liberal. So the question is, well, how did we get to a circumstance where we see that kind of attitude of shutting down discussion, demonising views as bigoted, demonising views as hate speech and so on? How did we get happening on the left, as well as all the liberal tendencies on the right? No one denies that there are liberal tendencies on the right. There always have been. But how did we move to that? So it's making a whole lot of leaps to say, well, because we want a more non-discriminatory society that we're post-liberal. No, that's not the argument at all. And if I made it sound like that's the argument, I didn't express myself very well. I hope I was explaining how we got from a point where a kind of liberal language and ideas of tolerance had a certain prestige a few decades ago, and how you just don't hear that sort of language or that kind of prestige attached to toleration and freedom of discussion. You don't see that so much on the left now, and you certainly don't see it on the right, of course. But then again, you never did see it on the right.
Thank you, Russell. Joe, your turn.
Yes, thank you, Russell, for your presentation. Very interesting indeed. And you mentioned on a couple of different occasions the failure for liberalism to deliver on its promises, so to speak.
Right.
And one of the things that if you look at this throughout history, I was wondering if you thought about this within the context of two things. One, a breakdown in dialogue. Right now, you obviously are talking about that right now, and I think that that's really important, the inability to even be able to have a conversation. And I say that only from a point of consciousness and self-awareness that people actually have about themselves, and the ability to actually evaluate themselves and actually engage with others, right? So there's one aspect of it. There's this degree of consciousness that that has to occur when you're listening to someone else. But I think that there is this other aspect of it, the technological part over the course of history. So there's these two things, right? So there's the technology, which it kind of changes the dynamics on how we learn, how we consume information. And you talked a little bit about information theory. Well, not information theory per se, but how information travels. And this other element of it is how the dialogue itself occurs. And I was wondering if you could kind of look at it through that lens and maybe look back and say, okay, well, at this point in time, we had Luther's Reformation, but it was the idea of the printing press, and these are things that happened in people's consciousness has actually changed. And then what resulted from that? So how we consume information and how that actually relates to what you're talking about and the ability for liberalism to exist, given a set of conditions that are changing rapidly. And I mean that especially today, that's more relevant than ever before, obviously, because we're undergoing quite a bit of technological advancements in a very short period of time. So anyway, I was wondering if you looked at it from the lens of over history, how information travels and where we're actually headed in the future, given what the rate and the pace of change that we've seen thus far.
Yes, I do have a bit
lately.
Yeah. I do have a bit to say about that in the book. Yeah. When the printing press was invented back in the middle of the 15th century, it opened up, it opened up all sorts of wonderful prospects, right? But it also opened up the prospects of very vitriolic public debate in the new sphere of public discussion that started to arise. That sphere of public discussion didn't take a form much like today's, probably until the 18th century. But what did arise earlier than that was this incredibly vitriolic use of the printing press at an earlier point. Luther used the printing press in an extraordinarily vitriolic way. and these opponents, but Luther was particularly famous for the way he used the printing press to whip up support and to whip up demonization of his opponents, whether they were Catholics or Jews or the peasants, at one point in Germany, or whoever it was that he didn't like. So Luther was famous for the way he used the printing press, and there's much concern about the printing press. Of course, there were licensing laws across Europe to try to restrict how it was used. And while overall, I think we would be glad that those licensing laws tended to die out over time, you can see why the sheer vitriol of the printing press that was used in the early days was a genuine concern. Of course, the main concern was just that the printing press could be used to dissent from the views of the established church and the government. That was the main concern about the printing press. But there is that history of how the printing press changed, the way discussion was carried out, and as you said, even the way people would think, the way they would present themselves. Now, fast forward, there's a long story about the printing press going way through the next several centuries and even to the present time. But we also saw the rise of new technologies, of course, during the 20th century. And in the last few decades, we've seen the rise of these new digital technologies. And I do think that's had an impact. It's hard to know at the moment exactly what the story is, but it certainly seems that the rise of social media over the past, 15, 20 years, whatever exactly it's been, that we've had social media as we know them now. So the rise of companies like Facebook and Twitter and just blogs, of course, in the earlier days, and all of the rest of the ways that people communicate digitally with each other, that has caused a huge ferment of ideas that's not being controlled from the top down. A lot of it's risen from the bottom up. And that has certainly played a role in both the kind of tone and mode of the discussion and in the way the ideologies themselves have been shaped. They've got to some extent out of the control of anybody. So there's a complex story to be told there. And I don't think we yet fully understand that story. There are lots of people working on this now that disagree with each other. I certainly don't claim to fully understand it, but I think it's part of the story. And I certainly do kind of make that point in the book. But I think it'll be a long time before we can look back and really have a good understanding of what happened with digital communication and social media during the early decades of the 21st century. That's going to be a huge story in itself, in much the same way as the rise of the printing press was.
Yeah, just really quickly as a follow-up, I do see this as something as that it's the democratization of information in a way. However, it seems like that we're actually more siloed. So there's some contradiction here because there's this element of kind of hearing what we want to hear and everything is personalized towards us. So we get caught up in these echo chambers that then reinforce our own biases. And this is where I come back to the idea of dialogue breaking down, and that relates to liberalism. So I think that this is an important point when we think about it, how information travels, how we consume information, the level of consciousness of a society in general, the ability for people to even accept the type of information that they're receiving. So that that all has an impact on this. So it's a democratization of sorts, but it's democratization of information.
Yeah, you're probably familiar, Joe, from what I hear you saying. You're probably familiar with the concept of group polarization.
Right. Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So, but for everyone else, the idea of group polarization is if you get a group of people who are at one end of a spectrum of ideas on anything, whether it's the size of a payout in a civil trial in court, whether it's political ideas, whatever it may be, you get a group who are all at one kind of end, and you get another group at the other end. There will be a range of views within each of those groups. Now, here's a question. Within each of those groups, does the view that emerges from the group tend to be kind of the middle of views within that group? That's what you might think would happen. What actually happens is that the group is likely to end up actually more extreme than any one individual within the group. That, you know, that the people within each group will be kind of egging each other on and finding new reasons for the general view that the group takes. And you'll end up with each of these groups more extreme than the individuals when you started. So you really don't want your group that doesn't want to pay out a lot of money in a court case and your group that does want to pay out a lot of money. You don't want those groups separate. You do want some kind of intermingling of ideas across all groups in society. Now, social media in particular, I think, have facilitated group polarization as a force in society. And that's led to some of the, you know, the general polarization that we see across society and the general intolerance that we often see. If you've got a group of people who start off with a, you know, just a somewhat extreme end on some spectrum, and they end up even more extreme, and you've got another group who end up even more extreme in the other direction, those groups are going to find it very hard to tolerate each other. That's a simple way of putting the story.
Thank you. Blue Jumper, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Just want to say, sorry for not having my camera on, but I just want to say first, thank you for letting me know about Catherine McKinnon being part of the liberal strands of the 70s and 80s. I have a book of hers in my bookshelf that I will summarily consign to the flames within the next hour or so.
Well,
But
you should read her and see what her arguments are, you know, and you might agree with some of them.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think I might do that first and then consign to the flames.
Okay.
But I wanted to first ask you about the sort of the standard view, which is the standard view is usually that the sort of, when you use the term New Left, I found that interesting because that is a term I've heard Roger Scruton use, who was a British conservative type. And what I find interesting about it is that it seems to me very difficult to pinpoint the theory that underlies what we see in society now, because there's so many different elements to it. There's the French side, there's the sort of continental philosophy, and then there's also the intersectional feminism that arose in the American universities. I wanted to ask, in particular with the rise of theory in literature departments in the latter half of the 20th century, if your research sort of took you there, and if there's anything that you found particularly interesting about that. And I guess, where does your view diverge from the standard view that is usually espoused as to how what we see happened is happening today? So that's it's a two-part question. So that's the first part. And the second part is, whenever I've tried myself to find the theoretical underpinnings of these questions, I find that people usually have a whole bunch of different terms to refer to the same thing. So I found that when I was looking through the conservative arguments, I found that somebody like Scruton used the term the New Left. I found that somebody like Harold Bloom used the term the School of Presentment. And I also find that whenever I see people trying to find terms to denote what they're seeing now, I've seen Jordan Peterson use the word cultural Marxism.
Yeah.
Everyone always says the term is inadequate, and it seems to me quite difficult to actually come up with the term which summarizes everything that everything can agree with, even though it seems like there's a single sense that we all are pointing to. So the first question is essentially, is there anything in particular that you find interesting in the rise of theory in literature departments? Where does your view, would you say, diverge from the standard account of how this has arisen in our society? And then finally, what's in a name, I guess, is so really it's a three-part question. So I might have overstepped my bounds, but that's essentially what I wanted to ask.
And there's a fair bit in each question, so I'll try not to be too wordy in answering it. The trouble is, if we're talking about literary theory and social theory of the kind that arose in France in the 1960s and the 1970s and started to become very popular in literature departments, maybe in the late 1970s in a few elite literature departments like Yale, but then increasingly in others across the world. That is itself a very complex phenomenon. Again, I'm old enough to remember when it happened. A lot of it happened smack in 1980. There was a famous conference of the Modern Language Association in the US in 1980, where the Yale deconstructors, the supporters of that style of French literary criticism, post-structuralist literary criticism at Yale, made a huge splash that year. They'd obviously been around for some time, but they made a huge splash that year, and that had repercussions all over the world. I remember there was discussion. I was teaching English at Monash in those days. I segued from actually teaching literature way back at that time to being a philosopher now. I've actually got a couple of PhDs. But I remember when it happened. I remember around that time, I'm struggling to remember the name of the literary theorist from Yale who came over, Howard Felperin. Howard Felperin came over and he became the head of the English department at the University of Melbourne. And I remember him giving a paper and people responding to it. So huge repercussions around about 1980. The trouble is when you look at these thinkers like the Yale deconstruction team and their diaspora such as Howard Felperin, and you look at thinkers like Foucault and Derrida, they're all very complex thinkers. And I would hate to generalize about them, or even to generalize about one of them. Any one of them, you could study their work for a lifetime and find a lot in it, both good and bad, probably. So what I think happened is a very vulgarized version of this kind of thinking became popular on American campuses. And it's that vulgarized version rather than the real deal that I think has tended to feed into whatever we're going to call this kind of ideology that we've been talking about. So that's a broad and vague response to your first question. It is very complicated. There has been, though, a kind of vulgarized version of all this that's very much about trying to undermine power relationships, particularly power relationships between groups that are seen as privileged and historically oppressed groups. And that vulgarized version of French, philosophical and literary and social thought has been influential in a way that Foucault, for example, possibly would have disowned if he was still alive and seeing it. Because Foucault, was all about resistance to power. In a way, I think he'd be even resistant to the power of people speaking in his name. So it is that complicated. So that was the first question. When it comes to things like the New Left, I mean, there was a period when the term New Left was being used, really the 1950s and 1960s. And I would really only want to apply it to that quite specific period in the history of the Western left. But yeah, I mean, the term does have some meaning. The term cultural Marxism, which we got to towards the end of your question, your three-parter, that's not a term that I'm super fond of. The reason I'm not super fond of it is it can be used in many ways, both legitimate and illegitimate ways. There was something that arose maybe in the 1950s, maybe even earlier with some thinkers, that could properly be called cultural Marxism, which was the application of Marxist ideas to the study of culture, right? And you can find well-known Marxist scholars in the field of cultural studies, establishing that field during that period. And you can call that cultural Marxism. And you know, there's nothing particularly wrong with cultural Marxism in that sense. You know, it's one stream of thought about how society and culture work, among others. And even if you disagree with it, as with reading Catherine McKinnon, you might read it and find, yeah, there's some stuff in it that's convincing. I actually think that Catherine McKinnon, by the way, does have some arguments that make sense. You know, almost any view from your opponents is probably going to have some grain of truth that's worth thinking about. And these people who can legitimately be called cultural Marxists doubtless did have ideas that were genuinely worth thinking about. My problem with the term cultural Marxism is it's often used to suggest that there's some kind of, you know, radical left-wing conspiracy to destabilize society, and it's described in a way that I just don't think is true. So if you go to whatever websites you can find it on these days, where the mass murderer Anders Breivik has his 1,000-page manifesto, he talks about, you know, this evil force, cultural Marxism, that's destroying society, and you know, it's trying to undermine things with, you know, corruption of morals, etc., etc. It's really hardcore, extreme right-wing stuff. And from his point of view, it justified going and killing a lot of people to try to fight it. Now, while Breivik is at the very extreme end of this, there are a lot of other people who throw this term cultural Marxism around who are using it much the way Breivik does. So you just got to be careful. That's a very different way of using it from the way that, you know, reputable scholars looking at the application of Marxism to culture might be using the term cultural Marxism. So I'm always going to want to know, well, how are you using the term? I think it's a legitimate term in some contexts, but I think you have to be careful about it. And I think, yes, some of the thinkers on the right, like Jordan Peterson, are headed towards that extreme that I reject. I mean, I'm not saying Peterson's, yeah, an Anders Breivik is going to go around mass murdering people, but I think he is using the term cultural Marxism in a way that I would tend to reject. I don't think he's using it in the legitimate scholarly way. Now, I probably left out the answer to the question in the middle. Could you just remind me again what that one was?
Oh, sorry. Yes, I'll have to find. He's muted himself. So Blue Jumper asked to unmute. Go ahead, Blue Jumper.
Yeah, that one. It was a three-part question. I think I only dealt with two parts, or maybe only one and a half.
Well, let's see. I wrote down some notes, thankfully. So let's see. So I guess the main question was the other section was where you would say your view diverges, if at all. I did notice, for example, that you sort of had a sort of cyclical account of in historically how certain societies have become more liberal.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say it's a cyclical account, but I think there are tendencies as to why, if you want radical transformation of society, and you think it's very important that transformation take place, A, you're going to have an unrealistic view of how quickly that can actually take place, but B, you might think because it's so important that you produce that radical transformation, that you're not prepared to tolerate any kind of opposition view at all, right? So I'm not saying that comes in cycles, but I do say that when those points come up, where one force wants radical transformation, and perhaps there's another force in society that has an equally radical idea saying, we must resist this kind of transformation, you will tend to get very intolerant views. You know, in those circumstances, liberal ideas are not going to be very successful. Now, where you might end up with some liberal ideas recurring is if the conflict becomes so violent that people start to say, well, you know, we just can't have this keeping happening. Yeah, that kind of happened after the wars of religion in Europe. It kind of happened after the French Revolution, but it's not cyclical in in the sense that you can say these things closely paralleled each other, or that there was some kind of historical determinism operating to force cycles to take place, like people like Oswald Spengler and other theorists of cycles of history will say. I don't think anything like that's happening in history. But I do think when certain kinds of similar circumstances arise, a logic of persecution can arise. And I do think that when there's a great deal of violence and suffering arising out of intolerance, that can produce some kind of backlash itself. I suppose even now I'm part of that backlash, saying, let's have less group polarization in our society. Let's have more willingness to talk to people who we disagree with, to read the works of people we disagree with, to let people who we disagree with have platforms. I am in a small way part of a backlash that's going on now, which might or might not be a successful backlash. I did say I'm not very optimistic about it, but I also said that if we come to understand what's going on better and how it came about and how it's a matter of historical contingency, that itself might help us to produce a more tolerant society. So it's worth writing books like How It Became Post-Liberal, I think, even if I'm not as optimistic about their successes as I'd like to be. Is that different from the common view that we hear around at the moment? Well, it's different from most views we were hearing until a few years ago. I think the kind of things that I've been saying in the tyranny of opinion 5 or 6 years ago, and in How We Became Like Post-Liberal now, I don't think we were hearing those views as a kind of liberal backlash, a backlash from the liberal left. I don't think we were seeing much of that until recently, but we are seeing a fair bit of it now. I could point to other writers and thinkers who are saying things, a bit similar to what I'm saying. I don't necessarily agree with all of their analysis. We're all individual people, but I do think that there are a few other people around who are putting views a bit similar to mine. So once again, we're in a situation where when we're seeing a lot of intolerance, which is causing a lot of anxiety in society, that itself produces a backlash of a kind. Another question you were asking, I think, was, what do we name the kind of ideology that I'm arguing against? Earlier, one of the questioners, I think, was objecting to my use of the term identity politics, but the term identity politics arose in the second half of the 1970s. That term has a quite specific origin that you can pretty much pinpoint in the second half of the 1970s. And I'm using the term very much as it was used then. There might be people on the right of politics who use it in a different way, but I'm using it in the sense it was used in the second half of the 70s, whereby various identity groups would run campaigns for the liberation and empowerment of those groups, but not necessarily based on traditional liberal ideas. And they would run those campaigns on a kind of joint front basis, referring to each other's successes, adopting the same language, and so on. That's a phenomenon that has a pretty pinpointable date in recent history and a pretty specific meaning if the term is going to be used correctly. So when I use the term identity politics, I think I am using it accurately, but I agree that there may be other people throwing around the term who are using it differently. And so it might also be a dangerous term. The term political correctness is a dangerous term because it's come to be applied to all sorts of things that I think are fine. The term woke is a bit of a dangerous term because, again, it's applied to all sorts of things that I think are fine. I see people being attacked. I see a lot of TV shows and movies being attacked as being woke. I see nothing wrong with them at all. So to take a perhaps trivial example, but it's an example I've come across, there's a show set in the Marvel universe, right? For any Marvel Cinematic Universe fans here, show called Ms. Marvel. Does anyone know that show? It features a superheroine who comes from a sort of ethnic Pakistani background in the US. It's not woke at all. You know, it's not woke in the sense of being intolerant or anything. It just shows this Pakistani family, you know, shows their internal issues and presents them in a sympathetic way. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with it. Liberals like me can be absolutely fine with it. But a lot of people on the political right think that even that is somehow objectionable. That's not my view. And if anyone thinks that's my view, you know, again, they're fundamentally misunderstanding me, or I'm expressing myself badly. I think a lot of stuff that's referred to these days as woke is just fine stuff, liberal stuff that reflects that we now live in a demographic diverse society, etc., etc. I think a lot of stuff that's condemned on the right as being politically correct is really just taking views that I think are very arguable and in some circumstances agree with. I myself have been called politically correct just for taking some fairly standard liberal feminist views, right? So all of these terms are dangerous. All of them can be exploited by fundamentally reactionary forces that are the enemies of liberals, as well as anyone else who is even mildly on the left of politics. So I don't know. Identity politics in the 1970 sense that I use it is perhaps not a term that people on the left want to use of themselves. Probably very few people now want to use the term political correctness of themselves, or ideological soundness, which is a term that we used back in the 1970s in a kind of self-mockery. Yeah, none of these terms are weaponized by the right, are terms that people want to use of themselves. But there's certainly a phenomenon there that I've tried to describe today, and which I describe in the book. And you have to kind of call it something. In the book, I refer to it just as being the ideology of the social justice in capitals movement. Yeah, there is an ideology there that is a post-liberal ideology in a sense. It's a left-wing post-liberal ideology. What's often called post-liberalism is an ideology of the right, and that is an ideology which wants to revert to a more theocratic Christian society. So even post-liberalism is, maybe a dangerous and difficult term. That use of the term post-liberalism to mean a movement on the right towards a more theocratic Christian society, that usage is pretty new. But it is a usage that you see around a lot. I better stop there, because there's a very long-winded way of saying that all of these terminologies are dangerous and can be weaponized and distorted. So it's hard to know. Given that people who subscribe to the kind of ideology that I'm talking about probably call themselves liberals in many cases, and they reject a lot of the terms such as wokeness or political correctness. There is no good name for that kind of post-liberal left-wing ideology, but we recognise that it's there. We should not, however, see it everywhere, where what we may be seeing may be something much more mild and defensible, as with my example of the Ms. Marvel show that's on Disney Plus.
Well, thank you, Russell. Jonathan, it's your turn.
On the topic of liberation, do you think that maybe society has shifted towards scapegoating as a means of progress? It reminds me of the idea of a book I remembered reading, but I forgot the title of it, where there's this lie about who the enemy is, so that the conflicting society that are having so much war gets to unite and fight against that enemy, so that the world has progress. Having this mythical enemy that doesn't even exist, just so that society functions. Do you think we're living in a similar situation, but not exact, where society is creating mythical enemies on people who do not deserve to be enemies, but for the sake of the greater good of some kind?
Yeah, I think there's an element of that. Look, I think there's an element of that in any society. I do think the rise of social media and the way social media can be used as weapons has contributed to some intensification in certain quarters. So that's part of it. You know, it's much easier to have a social media campaign against someone who's used as a scapegoat as a way of advancing your cause than was once the case. So I mean, to take some concrete examples, are people familiar with the Tim Hunt case? This was a case that arose a few years back in the UK where an academic, I think it's a professor of maybe chemistry, one of the hard sciences in any event, a very respected, I think even a Nobel Prize winning scientist called Tim Hunt from England. He was over in Korea and he was at a conference which was about supporting women in science. And Tim Hunt was someone who was very supportive of women in the STEM fields. But as part of the conference, he gave, must have been after dinner speech, which was a somewhat humorous speech. It was well received at the time. The largely female audience laughed. He made fun of himself. He talked about how, humorous and sometimes difficult situations can arise in the workplace with office romances and so on. And someone misrepresented that speech as saying that Tim Hunt wanted to have separate science labs for men and women because women distract men by being sexy, right? And there was a Twitter meme, hashtag distractingly sexy, that went after this guy, accusing him of saying something that was very far from what he actually did say. And he had an honorary position at one of the universities in London, and he was basically fired from that position. He was scapegoated in the media. As I said, this huge public shaming campaign against him. And, he had suicidal thoughts and so on. He's told his story. It was a terrible thing that was done to this innocent individual who was not anti-feminist at all. Now, there's been a lot of campaigns like that against individuals. And I suppose this was seen as a way of advancing the cause of feminism. Right? You could take this innocent individual, didn't matter that much whether you were misrepresenting him, didn't matter that much if a particular individual was greatly harmed by the harm, largely psychological, but he did lose his position and for his time, his reputation. You can go after individuals like that as a form of political activism.
Would you?
That has always happened, but I think social media makes it much more possible for that to happen. That's at least part of the answer to your question.
Would you suggest that ambiguity has taken center stage, leading towards a society that uses ambiguity to ignore pieces they do not particularly like about a person or group? For instance, they may ignore a bad aspect of a group by using ambiguous language, and then make clear language towards all the good aspects of that group, or the antithesis, where they create an ambiguous language surrounding the good aspect of that group, but being clear and concise about all the bad aspect of that group.
I'm not sure about that. It's not quite how I thought of it. You used the term ambiguity. It's quite how I've thought of it. The way I think about it, a couple of phenomena that I see, and again, I'm not the only one who sees these phenomena. I mean, one is a very common phenomenon that's always existed, which is just equivocation, running arguments where you use the same term in different senses. And, you can retreat to one sense if you're challenged while using another sense if you're not being challenged. So, I don't know, you can just all sorts of arguments that use equivocation. Maybe I'll think of a really nice example in a minute. But I want to talk about another concept, which is the concept of just expansion of concepts. Concept creep, as some people call it. So, for example, let's take the concept of hate speech. Now, hate speech could mean something very extreme. It could mean those of you who are familiar with the history of the Nazi regime and so on, and the lead up to it in the Weimar Republic, you'll be familiar with the outlet, the Nazi outlet, Der Stürmer, and Julius Streicher, the editor of that, which produces absolutely vicious, hateful, unrelenting anti-Jewish propaganda, calling through imagery and words and any other way, calling basically for the massive prosecution and even extermination of the Jews. And if you're a student of of genocides and war crimes and and crimes against humanity, you'll all be familiar with what happened in Rwanda in the 1990s, where there's a rising by a Hutu group to set out to exterminate another group called the Tutsis, and hundreds of thousands of Tutsis were killed, largely in massacres using primitive weapons such as machetes. And the people who were promoting this used the radio largely, a couple of radio channels in particular, to indulge in this hateful propaganda inciting the genocide of the Tutsis. And they referred to the Tutsis famously as snakes and cockroaches. It was a campaign of dehumanizing hate propaganda. So that's one extreme of what the term hate speech might mean. It might be this kind of stuff that the genocidaires of Rwanda or the Nazis in the 1930s and 1940s were coming up with, to incite, extermination on a monstrous scale of groups like the Jews and the Tutsis. That would be one meaning of the term hate speech. But at the other end, you'll see the term hate speech attached, say, to the pretty mild and thoughtful kind of thing that you'll see J.K. Rowling saying when she is criticizing certain aspects of transgender activism. Now, I've seen many people, in fact, condemning the things J.K. Rowling says as hate speech. But it's obviously nothing like the sort of stuff that I was talking about earlier with the Nazis and with the genocidal campaigns in Rwanda. So what do we mean by hate speech? That's an ambiguous term. At one end, it means this kind of thing that nobody wants, and which is banned even in the United States. I think that law would probably even survive First Amendment scrutiny, though I don't know. As far as I know, it's never come up against First Amendment scrutiny. But even the United States has that law on its books. Law against inciting genocide, a law against the Julius Streicher type stuff. But at the other extreme, all kinds of stuff can be called hate speech. So what does it mean? It's an ambiguous term, and it can be used to demonize people as if they're another Julius Streicher when they're nothing like that. So I don't know if that's maybe not quite the sort of thing you're talking about, but it's certainly a phenomenon that I see in society of the way ambiguous terms are used. And hate speech is just one of them. The term violence is another. The term violence has always had a fairly clear meaning in the past. It's the use of physical force to inflict pain or injury, or maybe it could apply to to certain kinds of property damage. But it does refer to physical force. But now you'll see the term violence being used just to refer to the expression of some point of view that people disagree with. It's called violence because, it has some kind of negative impact on some sort of group. And so once again, you can see stuff that J.K. Rowling says being characterized as violence. You can even see people being accused of engaging in violence by not saying anything at all, but just not disagreeing with some view that's being put and which is thought to be a harmful view. So the term violence has now, as a result of concept creep, become this kind of radically ambiguous term. And the term harm, similarly, when you go back and look at John Stuart Mill's book on liberty, and he puts this thing called the harm principle, where he's saying we shouldn't have laws against things unless they cause harm. We shouldn't even have social condemnation of things unless they cause harm. He meant something pretty strong by the word harm, right? He is thinking of maybe well, he's thinking of secular harm, not harm to people's spiritual interests. He's not really thinking of psychological harm. He's tending to think of physical harm, really, but maybe harm to reputation. Maybe harm financially, some kinds of harm beyond just physical harm. But he's got a pretty high threshold of what counts as harm. And that was what liberals always meant by harm, something with a pretty high threshold. But now again, you'll see somebody who merely puts a view that's considered inconvenient to a particular political cause being accused of causing harm. So the term harm has now become this kind of radically ambiguous term as a result of concept creep. Now, again, that's probably not quite what you're thinking of. We probably do have something going on a bit more like what you're thinking of, which is the demonization of groups that we don't like, being not prepared to say anything very clear about what's good about them, and the valorization of groups that we do like, we're not prepared to say anything particularly clear against them. So that sort of double whammy of demonization and valorization, that certainly does exist. I think that's probably already existed, but once again, group polarization can only exacerbate that going on in our current society.
Thank you, Russell. Ken, go ahead.
Thanks, David and Russell. Yeah, look, thanks for the talk, and thanks for engaging with the conversation. I just like to offer a slightly different view of why liberalism might be in decline, and I just want to
Right.
hear what your thoughts might be on that. So, I think liberalism as a philosophy has its own contradictions, and that
Right.
needs to be acknowledged. So, oftentimes today when we see like the rise of toleration, we seem to think that, it's because of outside forces that are being intolerant, and we need to protect this sort of middle ground of toleration. But then, there are problems with this idea of toleration itself, right? So, I mean, at the very basic level, like there are limits. So we don't want to tolerate like murderers, rapists, or whatever. So that's at the very basic level. And then you can move a step further. We can say we don't want to tolerate hate crime, discrimination, and that sort of thing. So the question is like, where do we actually draw the line, right? So then, I mean, like Karl Popper says, a liberal society should not tolerate the intolerant. So we should only tolerate other people who are tolerant. But then that's also sort of vague as well, right? So like a lot of examples of today's intolerance, I think, are done in the name of tolerance. So like Russell, your example of when, like we said, the first I said something about women, right? Like he was being misinterpreted and attacked. Like when I think about it, he was actually attacked in the name of more tolerance for women. Like people thought he was being sexist or all that because, like, I mean, he was misinterpreted, but people thought he was being sexist. So
Right.
he was actually being attacked for being perceived intolerance, right? So, like today we see liberalism has itself split into like broadly two sort of groups. Like you've got the right liberals who want more freedom of speech, more personal freedom, less government intervention, all that sort of thing. And you've got leftist liberals who want more like respect for women, minorities, LGBTs, people, and so on. And I think this is like, this just shows the inherent contradictions of liberalism. So I mean, yeah, look,
Yeah.
I don't think
I'm
like yeah. So I just feel like there is this inherent contradiction in this idea of toleration, and it feels like a ceasefire in the middle of a war. It's like yes, you should engage with people you disagree with, but then like what's next? You have to move beyond tolerance, and because of this
yeah. Yeah.
inherent contradiction, like liberalism itself, I think it's unstable, and sooner or later it's bound to collapse. So I think we need to
Yeah.
move to something else, move to
Look,
like another
I'm not sure
philosophy.
I'd use the term contradiction. I tend to use that term in a quite technical way, but I understand your point though,
Yeah,
and you're right. Whether you call it a tension or a contradiction, or whatever you
yeah,
call it, um, that phenomenon is part of liberalism. I agree, and And we have to remember that liberalism, I mean, I don't think liberalism was ever a single political theory. You know, it was always a broad tendency, and it was the confluence of several groups historically. So it's not surprising if there are different people within that broad tendency who take different views. So yeah, those sorts of problems will always arise within liberalism. I agree with you on that. And so there's then the question, well, how do we try to resolve them? And there's no really clear answer to that question. There's this paradox of toleration that Karl Popper talked about. You know, do we have to tolerate Nazis? I mean, that's really what Popper was getting at. Do we have to tolerate Nazis? And maybe we don't. The thing about Nazis, if the
Where you draw the line is the
Nazis
question,
want to
right?
come to power through violence, when they get power, they want to rule through violence. And when they get power, they want a totalitarian society. They want to repress any views other than their own. There are all sorts of reasons why at that extreme, the Nazis at least, seem to be a group that the liberals are going to find very difficult to tolerate. So there is a kind of limit. How far do we tolerate things like, Nazi marches through Jewish suburbs, as famously happened in the US? How much do we tolerate, the people going around in a serious manner, not a sort of satirical manner or something, giving Nazi salutes publicly, all of that. I tend to think of Nazis as a very special case, but there certainly can be other groups. I mean, right now we have this controversy about people flying the flags of organizations like Hezbollah. Should that be tolerated or not? I mean, I would actually tolerate flying those flags, but that's not because I like Hezbollah. But there are these questions within liberalism. Where do we draw these lines? I would say we should err on the side of tolerating, and that has traditionally been the view of liberalism. But there's no clear line to be drawn. There will be arguments within liberalism as to what we can tolerate and what can't we tolerate. Now, with a question like the Tim Hunt case, you're right. The journalist who really got this going doubtless thought she was striking a blow for, in a sense, greater toleration. I mean, it's funny. I wouldn't really call that toleration so much. It's not like we tolerate women, but you're striking a blow for women's greater success and greater respect and greater opportunities in society, right? But she did this in a way that involved scapegoating an individual, misrepresenting that individual. And I don't see how she could have done it without knowing that that was what she was doing. All of the evidence is that it was pretty clear that what he said at that conference was not what she represented him as saying. So either she was very hair trigger, and that led her to misrepresenting him in a way that was kind of sincere. She really thought he'd said something like that, which is itself a problem, being that hair trigger, or she was prepared deliberately to misrepresent him in the name of her greater cause. Now, both of those things I think are worrying. You can have a society that becomes so polarized, everyone's on a hair trigger, and they will go around misrepresenting each other, at a very low threshold. Or you can have a society where people are so fanatical that they are willing to destroy individuals for their greater cause. I don't think either of those is what liberalism has traditionally wanted. Liberalism has traditionally wanted, in its vague way with different, tributaries going into it and so on. It has generally wanted to have public discussion without people kind of attacking each other as morally corrupt individuals, but rather trying to discuss the issues themselves. I think that is something that liberalism has traditionally fairly consistently maintained. And I don't think there's an inconsistency or a contradiction in that. I think there are just points about, well, where do you draw the lines with some of these ideas that seem beyond the pale for various reasons, such as Nazism? I think it can often be resolved in practical terms. But I agree with you. On the one hand, I think a sort of liberal approach to public discussion can be undermined if we have this very polarized, very hair trigger or extremist society. But I also agree with you that liberalism has its own, at least internal tensions that can make it hard for it to find exact places to draw various lines. That clearly has to be conceded.
Thank you, Russell. George, your turn. Go ahead.
And I'm running out of energy a little bit, so maybe we have just a couple more questions, David. And
Thank you.
I'll
Let me
at
answer
least
a
lead
question.
off.
I'm gonna ask you this. Okay. Now, I'm gonna ask you this: should this person that said this, should they be allowed to have managerial responsibility? Okay, where they're
Are we talking about
overseeing
Tim Hunt, or are we talking about
men
the
and women.
person?
I'm just gonna read something here. Let me tell you about my trouble with girls.
Right.
3 things happen when they are in the lab.
Yeah.
You fall in love with them, they fall in love with you,
Yeah.
and when you criticize them, they cry. Okay. Now, ultimately, you could see where women who work in this lab with this man, who work under his authority, would say, "Look, this man is not. He doesn't have he doesn't have the outlook necessary or appropriate to run a lab with this kind of attitude." I mean,
Right.
in the end, it seems to me what you are actually criticizing is liberalism, right? In other words, liberalism rightly takes issue with illiberal views because it presupposes that people are going to be judged on their actions, their words, not on their gender, not on their gender selection, right? Not on their skin tone. So here you have a manager of a lab who is expressing the idea when you criticize women, they cry. Again, I think it's fair to say that this person should not have managerial authority or oversee graduate students, etc. Right? I mean, what's the problem with removing that person?
Okay. So okay. Look, yeah, this talk, you read out 3 sentences from that talk. This talk was a funny after dinner speech, or a funny speech at the end of the conference, or whatever. It was a little bit of stand-up comedy that he was doing after he'd taken part in this conference, where clearly he had been at the conference and had been his whole career, an advocate and supporter of women in science. And all of the evidence that we have of the way it was received and understood at the time by the women at the conference was that they saw it as, yes, these funny situations arise with men and women in the lab, and they laughed. It went down well with a whole bunch of women who were pretty clearly feminists. So yeah, sure, you can take a funny after dinner speech, take a few lines of it out of context, ignore the way it was received at the time, and paint this guy as what you just said. This person has these ideas that women shouldn't be, etc. But that is a distortion of what the guy was actually saying in context, both in the speech, the way the speech was received, and the way he acted at the conference in general, and the way he acted in his career in general. We could all probably have little bits of things we've said in occasions where it wasn't out of line or might have been appropriate, or even occasions where it might have been a little bit out of line if we'd had too many drinks or something. But I don't think that was the case here. We can all have snippets taken of our lives like that, and it can be held up for public shaming and ridicule and attempts to destroy our careers. So of course you could find some occasion to do with someone like Tim Hunt, if he was going to be asked to give a humorous speech. Of course, those sorts of things can arise. But I think it's a fundamentally illiberal attitude to take a snippet like that and use it to try to destroy someone as an individual as a way of promoting your political cause.
Well, thank you, Russell. Look, there's a few people with their hands up to ask questions or make comments. Let's let 2 who haven't had a chance up before to do so, and then we'll call it an evening or a day. So we've got Elle and Peter. So Elle, go ahead.
Yes. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much, Dr. Blackford, for your talk. I really enjoyed it, particularly the part on tolerance. And then the other piece that you were discussing most recently, I think in response to somebody else, about online and the wokeism and the hate. So there's been several instances online where, as you said, it's almost as if, you know, I wonder if people would say the things they say online in person to you. I think not, or they might think twice about it. But there's been several instances where I've been in conversations in either in meetups and Zoom like this or online where people have said the most shocking things, and I've called them on it, or somebody else has called them on it, and they end up being muted or and not allowed to talk, or just basically labeled something and kicked out. For instance, there was one talk where a woman, and this gentleman had said it several times. He was, I believe, Middle Eastern or Indian. At any rate, he didn't feel comfortable in the UK because he was surrounded by so many Caucasians, and wasn't comfortable with Caucasians, and he made that plain several times that we met. And one person called him out on it and said, well, you know, that's borderline kind of racism. What you're saying is that you prefer to be with brown people the same color as yourself, and you're not comfortable with people of a different shade of skin. And that person was kicked out of the meeting, and she never was allowed to attend again. And there's just these things that happen online like that, and it's very undemocratic, right? Because obviously you can't say whatever you want online. So my question to you is, in this age of online social media, is it not an example sometimes of a very autocratic censorship that goes on online? And what is the mechanism, if there is a mechanism, or what is the antidote to that? Because it just seems to me that there are some forums where you are free to speak your mind, and it's more, as you say, tolerant. But then there's other forums that other people run where if you dare to disagree with someone, or you point out the obvious, like I just said, and the powers that be, whoever's running the meeting, are obviously of a certain mindset, kick you out, and you just have no voice, and what you've done is totally, which was, in my opinion, she was correct in what she did, but the people that are running it did not think so. So that's my question to you: is where is the justice in this? Where is the justice in online forums?
When you say she was correct in what she did, the person who said she was uncomfortable with Caucasians was correct to say that? Is that?
Yeah, I mean,
I think that's fine.
I don't participate in that group anymore, but this particular person was a mediator, and he said it many, many times how terrible he felt growing up in this particular environment because there was no one that looked like him. And then finally, after he had said it many times, somebody called him on it and said, well, that's kind of racist what you're saying to us, and you've said it several times, but she was kicked out. But that was her opinion, and she may or may not have been right. I don't know. But again, it's a difference.
I think it's perfectly reasonable for people of color who may have grown up in a society where they have felt oppression on the basis of their color or racial background to end up feeling uncomfortable with white people. I mean, I think that's perfectly understandable. I think it's perfectly reasonable to say that that's the case. And I think it's perfectly reasonable for a person of color to say, well, actually, I'm one of those people who feels uncomfortable. That seems fine to me. Now, I mean, if it's pressed relentlessly in a way that's disruptive of the meeting, I don't know if that was the case here, but I mean, I can imagine it could be pressed in a way that became disruptive, but just saying it seems fine and reasonable to me.
Yes. And there's been other instances, like I said, there's been one where it was East against West. And basically women from the West are trash and women from the East are noble and good and all that, which is not true, but and somebody calls them on that and they're muted and they're told,
Yeah.
And treated a certain way. So there's been instances, what I'm saying online, and I'm sure many other people would have many other examples of different things that have been said that have been very biased. And when they try to call that person out that's saying that is rather biased what you're saying and why it's saying it, not in an ugly way, but just in a critical way to say, hey, that is kind of biased what you're saying. And then
So it's the
they're
person who was,
chastised for it.
yes. So maybe everyone else is following and I'm not, but the person who was excluded from the meeting, was that the person who said they're uncomfortable with Caucasians, or was it the person who objected to that?
It was the
It was the
person
person who objected to it, right?
who,
Is that,
and keep in mind, this
Yeah,
person
yeah.
had said this repeatedly in different meetings over and
okay.
over again, and I think
Yeah,
people were just
okay.
tired of hearing it and
Yeah. Well,
saying,
yeah,
so
okay.
we move on from that.
Yeah, all right.
But she didn't say that. She was just saying, if you're not, if that's the way
Yeah.
you feel about Caucasians, and being around them, that could be construed. She was saying it could be construed as racism. She didn't call him a racist. She just said
Yeah.
it could be construed that way.
Yeah, okay. Look,
Just
it
as
sounds
if
to
I had with,
me,
yeah.
it sounds to me like both people are being reasonable from what you've said. Yeah,
Mhm.
it seems to me perfectly legitimate for the person of color, to have that feeling of discomfort based on, their past life. You could say it's racist, I suppose, but it's not surprising that people who come from a background where they have been discriminated against should then feel that kind of discomfort. I don't think that's an unreasonable thing for them to feel at all, or for them to say. On the other hand, I can also see a case for saying, well, there's something objectionable about it. That seems like an area where discussion could take place between two reasonable people with those respective points of view, and neither should be censored. Now, if one of those people, they got to the point where they were just kind of insistent on it, perhaps noisy about it, perhaps getting to the point of being disruptive, then whoever's chairing the meeting has to make some kind of decision. Now,
Yes.
if the person who was making the original comments about feeling discomfort with Caucasians had not actually got to the point of being disruptive, I wouldn't kick them out. And if the person who objected and said, well, that's a little on the racist side, really, maybe you should think well, if that's all they said, I think they should have been chucked out either. But of course, running a meeting is hard. And often there are different personalities involved, and there's fine decisions to be made. But I would not have penalised either of those people. The first person, as you'd explained it to me, was not penalised, but I would not have penalised the second person either. I've just maybe tried to get them both to speak in a kind of civil, thoughtful manner to each other. If they got to the point where they were not acting in that way, well, then you've got a different situation. There was a situation here on the ABC on a current affairs program. Particular program was about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and a member of the audience was asking a question to the panel, and in asking the question, he was putting the case that Russia does actually have grievances against Ukraine and the West, and so there was some kind of rationale for the invasion, and he was thrown out. Now, I wouldn't have thrown him out either. I mean, Russia probably does have some legitimate grievances. That doesn't mean that they should be settled by invading Ukraine. But we're often not told what Russia's grievances are, because Russia's just the enemy. This might be relevant to one of the earlier questions about the ambiguity, about the demonization of people. The fact is, if you look into it, there's probably some grain of truth, even in what Putin's saying. And so, well, it's worth listening to these things rather than just throwing someone out merely because they express that view, which is not to say at the end of the day they'll support the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Of course, that's totally unlawful under international law, totally objectionable morally, etc., etc. But I would want to hear the widest range of views and see what kind of merit, what grain of truth there might be in all of those views, if if that kind of environment can be created.
Well, thank you, Russell. Now, perhaps we can have Peter as our final question or commentator before you need to leave. And of course, the discussion will go on after you've absented yourself. Go ahead, Peter.
Okay. Yeah, I feel so privileged here. So one phrase that I did not hear you mention at all is critical race theory, which you may touch on things like political correctness and I forgot the other things, but similar things, but not critical race theory. And I've got in front of me the book, Critical Race Theory, an Introduction. And so in the glossary of that book, they define liberalism. I just put their definition in the chat as a political philosophy that holds that the purpose of government is to maximize liberty and instill rights, the view that law should enforce formal equality and treatment of all citizens. So that sounds great, right? But they point out in the book, Critical Race Theory, that the critical race theory theorists oppose liberalism. They have a critique of liberalism, and they say why what kind of problems they have with liberalism. So they're not talking about what you were talking about so much as free speech and tolerance and that kind of thing. But so they say they're discontented with liberalism as a framework for addressing America's racial problems. Many liberals believe in colorblindness and neutral principles of constitutional law. They believe in equality, especially equal treatment for all persons, regardless of their different histories or current situations. And so then they say color blindness can be admirable as when a governmental decision maker refuses to give in to local prejudice, but it can also be perverse. And then they explain that. And they actually say here that critical race theorists are suspicious of another liberal mainstay, namely rights. Particularly some of the older, more radical critical race theory scholars with roots in racial realism and an economic view of history believe that moral and legal rights are apt to do the rights holder much less good than we like to think. In our system, rights are almost always procedural. For example, the right to a fair process, rather than substantive, such as right to food, right to housing, or right to education. So I just wanted to get in there that there is a critique of liberalism. I mean, their definition of liberalism, I mean, I think you would agree with that we would agree with generally that this is what liberalism means, what I put in the chat there. And so critical race theory, which is a big thing in the US, in law schools especially, does have a critique of that from the left.
Yeah. Look, I think the theorists who came along, like Derek Bell, had a point, right? So Derek Bell in And We're Not Saved and some of the other works by other theorists in that group that came out about that time. I've read some of those works. I've read Bell's work in some depth. I think that work has value. There is value in a critique of liberalism, but you can also see why that work was kind of necessary, or in a sense it was necessary, if you were very concerned, as people like Bell were, that liberalism had failed to deliver on its promises, right? Liberalism was supposed to, in its way, enable opportunities for people from all groups, because there would have been no hierarchies of birth anymore. People were not supposed to be seen as less human because they belong to these various groups, such as Black Americans and so on. So liberalism had big promises, which for whatever reasons, it had to some extent failed to deliver on. And it's not surprising that people started to develop critiques of liberalism and alternative ideologies trying to underpin the attempt to deliver on those promises. Critical race theory was part of that. Now we could debate back and forward just what in critical race theory is meritorious and what might be unrealistic or might be unfair. There could be big arguments about that. I certainly would not want to say, though, that there's no value in the work of some of these theorists. I would think that, as with the French post-structuralist thinkers like Foucault, I do think there's sometimes a tendency for complex work by people like Derek Bell as well to be vulgarized and to be turned into something much less complex and defensible and in a sense even liberal, open to a degree of those aspects of toleration and so on. To be vulgarized and weaponized and used in ways that have contributed to what I'm talking about, contributed to this kind of post-liberalism of the left. So that in very broad terms is what I have to say about critical race theory. I don't claim to be an expert on critical race theory, but I know a little bit about it, and that in broad terms is what I think of it. I think that's more or less what I say in the book. But I think that some thinkers who call themselves critical race theories are putting forward a vulgarized and not very defensible version of it, which has received, too much attention and empowered those individuals too much.
Thank you, Russell. Look, we've got one other person in the raised hand queue who hasn't been able to ask a question yet. It's Muri. So Muri, go ahead.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for this project. I so much appreciate it. Thank you, Dr. Russell, for presenting such an interesting topic. Your insights are truly appreciated. Well, balancing freedom of speech with respect for others in today's society is indeed a challenge.
Yeah.
Especially when these values come into conflict. On the other hand, freedom of speech allows people to express their opinions, even when those views are controversial or unpopular. To me, the key issue is determining where to draw the line between free speech and preventing harm. Then,
sorry, I've lost.
Okay.
I think Muri just paused. Go ahead, Muri.
Okay.
Okay. So the question I'm trying to ask is that where do we draw the line between protecting free speech and preventing harm? Should all speech be allowed, even if it incites hate or spreads misinformation? For example, we see the impact of harmful speech in situations like bullying among children in school, cyberbullying on social media, or verbal abuse between married couples. How should we approach these cases to balance free expression with the need to prevent harm? I would greatly appreciate your thoughts on this. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's a good question. It does relate back to one of the other questions about the the tensions within liberalism and issues of where you draw lines. Do we have to tolerate totalitarian movements like Nazism? All of which are difficult questions for liberals. Liberalism is political tendency. It's a confluence of different forces, and it does not deliver absolutely clear answers on some of these line drawing questions. However, the traditional view isn't that you get to say whatever you like, whatever harm that may cause. The traditional view is more, look, let's discuss ideas, and we will try to discuss ideas. It's not necessarily in an entirely civil way. We might sometimes get a bit cross with each other. We might sometimes be intemperate. But we will try not to make it personal attacks on each other, attempts to destroy each other. We will try to discuss ideas on their merits, even if we feel passionately about these ideas, and sometimes emotions run hot. So the liberal idea is more about discussion of ideas on their merits, rather than simply calling each other corrupt or wicked or evil people, trying to destroy each other as individuals. The liberal idea is you You don't try to reduce social change and consensus through that kind of speech. So John Stuart Mill, for example, is one of the great theorists of freedom of public discussion. But it's pretty clear that Mill wants to have free public discussion of all kind of scientific and religious and philosophical and social and cultural ideas. But he doesn't want, and he's pretty specific about this, he doesn't want people engaged in that discussion to be misrepresenting each other, to be just condemning each other as morally corrupt, etc., etc. You try to discuss the ideas rather than attacking the person. So that's one sort of line that you can try to draw. It's still a vague line, I suppose, but you can make that distinction. Mill would not have said we abolish all defamation law. He would not have seen, and he did not see, simply telling vicious untruths about an individual as a legitimate part of that freedom of public discussion. So if you and I were opposed on some political view, and I decided to advance my side of the cause by spreading a rumour that you're a Nazi or a pedophile or something else that's really despised in our society, right? Rather than discussing your ideas on their merits and perhaps trying to refute them and perhaps even try to find the grain of truth that might be in them. If I took this alternative approach, going and saying, oh, Muri's a pedophile, don't listen to, that's not something that Mill would have approved of. That's not something that Mill would have thought probably fell within the liberty of public discussion. Now, there may be problems with defamation law. I'm not saying defamation law is perfect, but Liberals can live with the idea that there is defamation law. Liberals, in fact, would think that approaching public discussion in that way, trying to destroy opponents by defaming them, is not the right way of conducting public discussion. So that's one kind of distinction that can be made. Incitement to harm people. So those cases like the Stürmer, with the vile anti-Jewish pornography, well, some of it was pornographic, but the vile anti-Jewish propaganda that was trying to stir up hate and violence against Jews, that's not the kind of thing that people have in mind when they're talking about Mill's kind of unhindered public discussion. The Nazi wished to create a totalitarian state in which a whole lot of things would be banned, including freedom of speech would be banned. That is a challenge to liberalism. Even here, because liberals are pretty slow to want to introduce censorship, it's a bit of a slippery slope potentially. Liberals might even show some toleration of Nazis, but there are going to be limits to it. The point's going to arise where you maybe are going to actually want to censor Nazis or prevent them talking at some things. But again, it becomes hard. An example from my own life, a few years ago, I was at a literary festival in Brisbane, the Brisbane Writers' Festival. And I was on a panel where the panelists were asked, are there some speakers who you think should not be invited to speak on panels at festivals like this? And the question came to me first, and the answer I gave was, well, yes, actual fascists. And I explained what I meant. I said people who actually do subscribe to a fascist ideology in a literal sense, who want to obtain power through violence, and who are going around using opportunities to speak at various forums to recruit members of their team who will be members who also subscribe to that kind of ideology and are prepared to try to seek power through violence. Now, such people clearly exist. These actual fascists exist. And I think it's legitimate to exclude those people from literary festivals, academic conferences, and all sorts of other forums, right? But the mediator or the facilitator of the panel then turned to the next person and asked them who they'd excluded, and they'd say hate speech. And then turn to the next person, they said hate speech. The next person said hate speech. So I had given this answer about actual fascists and how I defined that pretty narrowly, and what my basis was for excluding those people and only those people. But everyone else was saying hate speech. And no one was really defining what they meant. Did they mean the kind of thing that, the snakes and cockroaches, let's go and exterminate, the Tutsis? Did they mean that kind of thing? Or did they mean, the kind of thing that's often stigmatized as hate speech, which is really just disagreement about, certain issues that arise in relation to what we make of the ambitions of certain identity groups, such as, my example of that was J.K. Rowling. That never kind of got defined, and the speakers weren't really pressed on it. It seemed like they're using hate speech almost as a kind of mantra, rather than really having a view that, well, maybe they had thought through a view and just didn't express it, but there's no expression of any kind of view as to what is hate speech, why, given that definition of hate speech, which should be excluded, and so on. So I'm sticking to my line that the people I would exclude are the actual fascists, as I define them. And that's about all I would exclude from that sort of forum. But it's hard, we have this spectrum range of the actual fascists at one end, perhaps at their most virulent moments, seeking to exterminate certain groups even. At the other extreme, we have certain views that I think might even be quite defensible, might have quite a grain of truth in them. And, there might be quite a bit in there that's even defensible, but at any rate, should be tolerated and discussed on its merits. Where do you draw the line on that spectrum? There's no clear spot where you draw the line on that spectrum. What I would say, though, is that I think our society functions better. I think public discussion functions better if you draw the line way up at the end towards the actual fascists. That's kind of the liberal view, but it's not telling you a kind of algorithm for exactly where you can draw that line. I don't think there is any such algorithm. Okay. So, David, it's 4:20. I've been going for a while, so I'd be happy to thank everyone for their participation and to leave you to it.
Well, thank you for introducing us to the issues raised in your book, How We Became Post-Liberal and the Rise and Fall of Toleration. So everyone can join in thanking Russell.
Okay,
by whatever means. Anyway, Russell, yes, well, think about addressing us again.
Yep.
Please.
Okay. Thanks for inviting
Yes.
me, David. I appreciate it.
Okay, great. So
with those words, I will log off.
Great. Okay. Thank you.
Bye. Bye all.
Bye. And we'll continue the discussion.